There are questions that truly emerge only when night falls and all the noise has finally quieted. Why do we spend nearly our entire lives trying to make a living? Why have wealth, money, and work become the measure of a person's worth? And why, when exhaustion sets in or old age approaches, do we begin to ask ourselves whether we have lived in the right way at all? This video does not rush to provide answers. Instead, it guides you back to a quiet man, someone who changed the way we live, work, and understand modern society, Adam Smith. He was not a revolutionary waving a flag, nor was he a politician delivering speeches to crowds. Adam Smith was a contemplative scholar who sat back and observed everyday life, craftsmen at their benches, merchants at their stalls, ordinary people doing their best to get through each day. From these observations, he laid the foundations of the market economy, introduced the idea of the invisible hand, and shaped what would later be called capitalism. Yet what is mentioned far less often, and matters far more, is this: Adam Smith never spoke only about getting rich. He spoke about how people could make a living while still preserving their dignity. In the series, How Adam Smith Changed the Way People Make a Living Forever, we will not argue over winners and losers in economics. We will move slowly, like a deeply researched documentary, to understand why ideas written more than 2 centuries ago still quietly shape every meal we eat, every paycheck we receive, and every career choice we make today. You are listening to Deep Sleep of Power, where stories of power, ideas, and legacy are told in a voice gentle enough to help you relax and deep enough to invite reflection. If you appreciate this approach, please like and subscribe to accompany us on this journey, and in the comments, let us know. Which figure who changed the world would you like to hear about next? Tonight we begin with a very quiet man, but the modern world. Kirkcaldy was not a place people came to in order to change the world. It was a small port town, tucked quietly along the Scottish coast, where life moved at a slow, repetitive pace, so steady it was almost invisible. Ships arrived and departed, carrying goods, letters, and occasionally distant news from larger cities. Most of the time, Kirkcaldy was simply itself, quiet, familiar, and small enough that no face was ever entirely a stranger. It was in this setting that Adam Smith grew up, not amid grand ideas, but within the most ordinary exchanges of daily life. From an early age, he became accustomed to seeing people meet not to debate, but to trade for what they needed. Fish sellers, craftsmen, merchants passing through from elsewhere. Each carried a small fragment of the wider world, and only when placed beside one another did those fragments begin to make sense. No one here sustained themselves entirely on their own. Everyone depended on someone else, even if that dependence was rarely spoken aloud. To a child, these things did not resemble lessons. They were simply the way the world worked, yet it was precisely this ordinariness that left a lasting imprint. Adam Smith began to sense early on that society was not held together by extraordinary individuals, but by quiet, unspoken agreements between people. A promise kept. A fair exchange was completed, a measure of trust sufficient to continue doing business together tomorrow. No one needed to stand above the rest to coordinate it all. Order still emerged. In Kirkcaldy, making a living was never separated from communal life. People worked not merely to accumulate, but to keep the shared rhythm from breaking apart. Becoming wealthy, if it happened at all, was not a frequently mentioned goal. What mattered more was stability, that today one could trade for what was needed, and tomorrow there would still be someone willing to trade again. It was in this environment that Adam Smith began to distinguish, even without naming it, between getting rich and making a living, one driven by personal aspiration, the other by one's place within a social network. The adults around him did not speak of morality as a concept, yet the way they treated one another established an unspoken standard. Deception might bring short-term gain, but it quickly leads to isolation. Fairness, even when imperfect, was what allowed relationships to endure. The child observed all of this in silence and learned that society does not function on self-interest alone, but on reputation, trustworthiness, and the desire to be recognized by others. Kirkcaldy did not teach Adam Smith how to become wealthy. It taught him how people exist together. When one person performed their role well, others could rely on that effort to carry out their own. From these small actions, a larger picture gradually took shape. Society is the outcome of countless individual choices, yet not every choice is selfish. Many are made simply to preserve the fragile balance on which everyone depends. What is striking is that in this small world, Adam Smith saw no presence of imposed authority. No one commanded others on how to behave in order for society to function. Order appeared as a consequence, not as a design. Each person focused on their own task, and yet that very focus allowed the entire community to endure. This idea, though still unnamed, began to take root very early in his mind. These experiences did not lead Adam Smith to believe that human beings are always kind. He witnessed hard bargaining, sharp disagreements, and calculations that were far from admirable. But he also saw that even in such moments, people were forced to take others into account, for no one could stand apart from society and still survive. It was precisely this interdependence that compelled human behavior, no matter how self-interested, to adjust itself so as not to tear the entire network apart. From that small harbor, Adam Smith formed a durable intuition. Society is not a perfect machine, but it does possess the capacity to regulate itself, so long as people do not entirely lose their sense of connection to one another. This intuition did not yet resemble a theory. It was simply a deep-seated sense that order could arise from everyday life, rather than having to descend from centralized power. In retrospect, Kirkcaldy was not where Adam Smith learned economics. It was where he learned about human beings within economics, people of flesh and blood, with needs, limits, and a desire to stand securely among others. That foundation stayed with him throughout his life, even as he left the small town behind and entered far broader landscapes of knowledge and thought. Yet the stability of those early years did not last forever. Beneath the calm surface of exchange and community, life still contained unavoidable absences. When something suddenly disappeared, when a familiar presence was no longer there, the bonds between people were put to the test. And it was from that test that another deeper layer in Adam Smith's way of seeing the world began to form. A layer shaped by loss, observation, and faith. There are losses that make no loud sound, yet leave aftershocks that last an entire lifetime. When Adam Smith's father died, while he was still very young, the world did not collapse. There were no violent upheavals, no chaotic days that followed. Everything continued as before. Mornings still arrived. Ships still moved in and out of the harbor, and people still bought, sold, exchanged, and lived. Yet for a child, that absence quietly altered the way he stood in the world, not through visible grief, but through a deeper, more attentive way of listening. Adam Smith grew up in the care of his mother, a patient, resilient woman, closely bound to the surrounding community. In that small town, No one used grand words to speak of responsibility or morality. People simply did what needed to be done, helping when they could, sharing when it was necessary, and continuing with life. Within that simplicity, Smith came to recognize something essential at an early age. Human beings do not exist as isolated islands. When one link weakens, other links, imperfect as they may be, can still hold the entire network together. That experience did not lead him to believe that society is always good. It showed him only that society can become good if people do not turn away from one another. This belief was not built on abstract ideals, but on small, repeated actions. A word of concern, a quiet act of help, a presence that does not withdraw. For a child who lost his father early, this was more than comfort. It was living proof that the world, though fragile, could still be trusted. From this point, Adam Smith began to look at human beings differently, not merely as individuals pursuing their own interests, but as creatures capable of sensing the pain of others, even without fully understanding it, even without being able to carry it in their place. He observed how people behaved when there was no clear reward, when helping brought no immediate benefit, and he realized that there are actions that cannot be explained by calculation alone, yet are precisely what keeps society from falling apart. Notably, this belief did not make Adam Smith naive. On the contrary, it made him more cautious. Only those who have experienced loss truly understand the value of being supported, and only those who have been supported begin to ask a deeper question. What would happen if those bonds disappeared? If society expanded to the point where people no longer knew one another's faces, no longer directly felt one another's pain, how would trust endure? At its deepest level, this experience laid the foundation for a line of thought that would run throughout Adam Smith's life. Society is sustained not only by laws or power, but by the capacity for sympathy. When that capacity weakens, every system, no matter how efficient, becomes cold. And when people come to see one another merely as instruments, making a living can easily slide into a weary, undignified form of existence. It is no coincidence that Adam Smith consistently showed concern for those most vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, and those no longer strong enough to remain fully within the cycle of labor. This concern did not arise from pity, but from an early memory of being held by society when he himself was weak. He understood that a person's worth cannot be measured by productivity, because there are moments in every life when one needs support rather than judgment. From this foundation, Adam Smith's academic path began to open in a different direction. When he left familiar surroundings to enter a broader world of knowledge, the questions he carried with him were no longer simply, how does society function? But how should society function so that people do not lose one another? Years of observing everyday life have now transformed into a deep concern for moral life, where sympathy, respect, and the desire for recognition became keys to understanding human nature. From personal loss, Adam Smith did not seek to withdraw from the world. He chose instead to face it directly, slowly, patiently, and thoughtfully. And it was this choice that led him to a decisive turning point. Rather than beginning with money or markets, he began with a question about human beings. Once that question was posed, the journey ahead no longer revolved around a harbor or a small community, but expanded into lecture halls, where morality was carefully examined, and where he began to build the foundations of the ideas that would accompany him for the rest of his life. When Adam Smith left the familiar harbor town for Glasgow, he did not merely enter a larger city. He stepped into a space where people had begun to question themselves in a systematic way. 18th century Glasgow was not a center of political power, but it was a place where ideas moved with force. There, people did not study simply to know, but to understand how human beings lived together and why they behave as they do. The years in Glasgow opened a new world to Adam Smith, the world of moral life. Not morality as rigid commandments, but as a quiet current flowing through everyday behavior. He encountered ideas suggesting that human beings are guided not only by self-interest, but also by a desire to be seen by others, to be respected, and to feel that they belong to a shared order. What he had once sensed only dimly in the small community of his youth now began to find a language of its own. In Glasgow, Adam Smith learned to observe human beings not only from the outside, but from their inner motivations. Why does one person help another when there is no clear benefit? Why can injustice provoke outrage even when it does not directly harm us? And why does another person's pain sometimes make indifference impossible? These questions were not answered through doctrine, but by looking squarely at human experience. Morality, understood this way, was not something imposed from above, but something that arose from the capacity for sympathy. Crucially, Adam Smith did not see sympathy as a form of weakness. On the contrary, he began to recognize it as the foundation that prevents society from descending into chaos. When people are able to place themselves in the position of others, they adjust their behavior not merely out of fear of punishment, but out of a desire to be accepted. It is this desire that leads human beings to restrain themselves, to cooperate, and to seek fairness, even when no one is watching. His years of study in Glasgow also helped Adam Smith see more clearly something he had sensed early on. Human beings always live under the gaze of others. No one ever acts entirely in a vacuum. Every choice, every action unfolds within a social context where judgment, however silent, is always present. And it is this presence that creates an invisible spectator in the mind of each person, prompting self-examination before action. This is not control, but a subtle mechanism of self-regulation. From this point, a new understanding of human nature gradually took shape in Adam Smith's thinking. Human beings are not merely calculating individuals pursuing advantage. They are creatures who seek what they need, while also longing to be recognized as valued members of a community. Making a living, therefore, cannot be separated from dignity. A society that forces people to survive by sacrificing mutual respect will, sooner or later, fracture its own foundations. These ideas did not distance Adam Smith from real life. On the contrary, they allowed him to understand more deeply what he had long observed. Why relationships built on trust endure longer than those based solely on short-term gain. Why a community can survive not because of exceptional wealth, but because it preserves a sense that its members are not diminished, and why labor, when stripped of moral meaning, becomes a burden rather than a source of life. Glasgow was also where Adam Smith began to recognize the limits of purely mechanical systems. If society is viewed only as a collection of transactions, the most essential elements are missed: emotions, trust, and profoundly human fragilities. Morality, in his understanding, does not stand in opposition to reason. It completes reason, preventing it from becoming cold and cruel. A society that functions efficiently, yet lacks sympathy, may generate wealth, but it will struggle to achieve durability. For this reason, Adam Smith's years in Glasgow were not merely a period of study. They were the stage on which he laid the groundwork for all his later thought. Before speaking of markets, he wanted to understand human beings. Before discussing wealth, he wanted to know what makes people feel they are treated fairly. And before asking how fast a society might grow, he asked whether it could grow without exhausting those who lived within it. Yet alongside this intellectual opening, another feeling slowly emerged. As Adam Smith looked beyond the academic environment of Glasgow, he began to notice a contrast between ideas that remained alive through contact with lived experience and forms of knowledge that were drifting away from reality elsewhere. Not every center of learning cultivated questions about human beings. In some places, knowledge existed as form rather than substance, detached from the life it was meant to serve. It was this realization that led Adam Smith toward another experience, less warm, yet no less important. When he entered an environment where knowledge was repeated more often than lived, where tradition weighed heavier than observation, questions about society became more urgent than ever. From Glasgow, where morality was felt as the very breath of life, his journey continued into a different space, one in which he would be forced to confront the emptiness of knowledge when it loses its connection to human beings. Oxford appeared before Adam Smith, not as a dream, but as a symbol. Its old stone walls, vast libraries, and academic rituals repeated across generations all bore the imprint of a place that had once stood at the center of European learning. For a young man nurtured in the spirit of inquiry at Glasgow, Oxford seemed like the natural next step. Yet it was precisely in this place, seemingly overflowing with knowledge, that Adam Smith first felt something difficult to name: emptiness. At Oxford, knowledge was not scarce. What was lacking was life. Lectures were read directly from old texts, concepts transmitted as immutable truths, rarely tested against the realities of lived experience. Adam Smith found no pressing questions about people who were living, working, and colliding with the world around them. Instead, there was a heavy atmosphere of tradition, where knowledge was carefully preserved, but seldom challenged. This disappointment did not arise from arrogance, but from a clear intuition. Knowledge, when detached from life, becomes rigid. Adam Smith had observed people at the harbor, felt the quiet support of community, and learned about morality as part of everyday behavior. Now standing amid an immense treasury of books, he could no longer find those people. The pages spoke of the world, but the world itself seemed to have departed long ago. Oxford revealed to Adam Smith a dangerous distance, the distance between scholarship and life. There, knowledge was taught as a complete system, needing no revision, no listening to reality. Yet the society he had observed was not static. It moved, adapted, and at times contradicted the very theories deemed unchangeable. This tension quietly fostered in him a healthy skepticism. If knowledge does not help human beings understand one another better, what purpose does it serve? Importantly, Adam Smith did not respond by turning his back entirely on scholarship. He did not reject the value of classical learning, nor did he dismiss tradition, but he began to understand that tradition, if not resituated within the present, gradually becomes mere form, a beautiful shell covering the absence of the most essential question. How does society function when no one controls it in its entirety? Within that environment, Adam Smith learned a difficult yet necessary lesson. Not every place that bears the name of learning encourages independent thought. Some people are accustomed to repetition rather than observation, and that repetition, when prolonged, can strip knowledge of its ability to touch life. For someone accustomed to seeing human beings in relation to one another, this was a suffocating feeling, like listening to a familiar piece of music played so slowly that its melody gradually dissolves. Oxford also showed Adam Smith another face of power, the power of institutionalized knowledge. When knowledge becomes the property of a group, it tends to close itself off, resistant to what comes from outside. Lived experience, the ordinary observations of working people, does not easily enter such academic spaces. This led Adam Smith to begin asking whether there might be another way to understand society, one that did not require standing in an ivory tower, yet was still deep enough to reveal the structures beneath. It was in this sense of alienation that Adam Smith gradually formed a habit of self-directed study and independent observation. When lectures no longer offered answers, he returned to books on his own terms, selecting, comparing, and connecting them to what he had seen in real life. Knowledge, in this approach, was not something to be passively absorbed, but a tool for asking better questions. And those questions were not about what people ought to think, but about how people actually live. Oxford, though it did not provide intellectual fulfillment, played another crucial role. It forced Adam Smith to leave behind the safety of ready-made systems. When old answers no longer persuaded, he had no choice but to return to what had always accompanied him from the beginning, observing human beings in everyday life. It was this absence that created a space, and within that space a large question began to resonate more clearly than ever. If society does not require a single guiding hand to function on a small scale, what keeps it from collapsing as it expands? If human beings possess the capacity for sympathy and self-regulation, why do so many systems appear heavy and distant from life? And if knowledge cannot answer these questions by repeating the past, then a new approach is needed, one that begins with human beings, not with books. From Oxford, Adam Smith carried away not satisfaction, but an intellectual unease. That unease did not cause him to abandon thought. It compelled him to think more deeply and more independently. As he left behind that formal academic world, he was ready to confront the question that would follow him for the rest of his life, a question that would not release its hold, the question of social order, of labor, and of how human beings might live together without the constant presence of a controlling hand. There are questions that do not arrive like a flash of lightning, but like a very soft knock, repeated again and again in the mind, until one can no longer ignore it. For Adam Smith, that question formed early, yet only became fully distinct after years of observing life and confronting inherited knowledge. Why does society continue to function even when no one controls it in its entirety? Not in moments of crisis, but in the most ordinary days, the question remained, quiet, persistent, refusing to leave. He had seen order arise in a small town where people simply did their own work and the whole community still endured. He had felt society's support during the most fragile moments of life. And he had also witnessed knowledge grow rigid when detached from lived experience. All of these experiences gradually converged on a single point. Social order cannot be explained by power or command alone. If that were the case, why did people still find ways to coordinate with one another in places where no guiding hand was clearly present? This question was neither confrontational nor rebellious. It carried the shape of deep curiosity. Adam Smith did not seek to prove that society is always good. He wanted only to understand why, among countless possibilities for disorders, human beings so often choose cooperation. What makes a person follow unwritten rules? What leads them to restrain themselves even when exploitation is possible? and what keeps these fragile relationships from completely falling apart. As he reflected on these matters, Adam Smith gradually realized that one cannot begin with systems. Systems are merely outcomes. To understand order, one must return to human beings, not idealized humans, but people as they truly are, both self-interested and capable of sympathy, calculating, yet yearning for respect. The question that would not release him was not, how do we control society, but what is it in human nature that allows society to hold itself together? At its deepest level, this was a moral question, not an economic one. It touched the hidden motivations that guide behavior, the desire to be seen by others, the fear of isolation, the sense of shame when doing wrong, and the quiet satisfaction of acting in accordance with shared expectations. Adam Smith began to see that these forces were more powerful than any law. They require no overseer because they already live within each individual. That question also led him to reconsider the notion of self-interest in a different light. Interest does not exist in a vacuum. A person may pursue what benefits them, but they must still take into account the reactions of others. If their actions shatter shared trust, those benefits will quickly disappear. And so, even without coercion, people learn to adjust their behavior, not because they are always virtuous, but because they live together. It was here that Adam Smith began to clearly sense the difference between coercion and self-regulation. A society built entirely on commands will always require more commands. But a society in which people possess the capacity for self-reflection and sympathy can function with far less pressure. The question would not leave him because it opened a bold possibility. Perhaps order does not need to be imposed from the outside if it is already nurtured from within. This line of thought did not make Adam Smith blindly optimistic. He was acutely aware of human limitations. Selfishness, ambition, and blindness are ever present. Yet for that very reason, he became more attentive to the subtle mechanisms that prevent society from sliding into chaos. These mechanisms are not always effective, but they are strong enough to keep shared life from completely disintegrating. Understanding them, in his view, mattered more than dreaming of a perfect system. The question also made Adam Smith patient. He did not rush to conclusions. He observed longer, read more carefully, and thought more slowly. Every lived experience, every small human action, could be a fragment of the larger picture. Gradually, that picture emerged not as a mechanical diagram, but as a network of emotions, expectations, and mutual responses. Social order, seen this way, resembled a fragile balance, one that must be continuously maintained, never fully perfected. From this point, Adam Smith's intellectual path began to turn in a more defined direction. To answer the question seriously, he needed to delve into the inner life of human beings. It was not enough to observe outward behavior. He had to understand the emotions that drive it. Why do people feel unsettled by injustice? Why can they feel joy at another's success, or sorrow at pain that does not directly touch them? Where do these emotions come from, and what role do they play in keeping society from collapsing into a world where the strong simply overpower the weak? The question would not let go, because it demanded a new foundation for thought, not one rooted in power, nor in profit, but in morality and sympathy. Adam Smith gradually realized that before speaking about how people make a living, he had to understand how they see and judge one another. Before discussing markets, he needed to answer why human beings care so deeply about how they are regarded by others. As this direction of thought became clearer, a new door opened. Scattered observations of life began to find a shared language. Adam Smith entered a phase in which the focus was no longer the structure of society, but the nature of human beings within society. From the persistent question of order, he moved closer to exploring moral sentiments, where sympathy, judgment, and the desire for recognition become the keys to understanding why people are able to live together longer than they fight one another. And it was precisely at this threshold that his journey prepared to move to a deeper level, the level of moral sentiments, where human beings are seen not merely as actors, but as creatures capable of being moved by one another. There, the question was no longer how society functions, but who human beings are when they stand before one another, a question that would lead him to his first major work and lay the foundation for his entire intellectual legacy. After many years of carrying a question that refused to leave him, Adam Smith finally found the language to express what he had observed from a very early age. Human beings do not live by interest alone, but by moral sentiments. When he set pen to paper to write his first major work, it was not a book about money or markets, but a patient effort to understand human beings from the inside, how they feel, judge, and regulate their own behavior while living among others. At the core of Adam Smith's thinking at this stage was the concept of sympathy, not sympathy as fleeting compassion, but as a profound capacity that allows a person to imagine themselves standing in another's place. Through this capacity, human beings do not act blindly on personal desire alone. They pause, consider, and ask themselves, if I were the other person, how would I feel? It is this silent question that creates a moral space where action is examined before it occurs. Adam Smith was not naive in believing that people always behave well. He clearly saw selfishness, envy, and ambition, yet he also recognized that these impulses rarely exist in isolation. They are almost always accompanied by another desire, no less powerful, the desire to be accepted and respected by others. People may pursue their own interests, but they seldom wish to be regarded as immoral. And it is this fear of judgment that leads them to regulate themselves, even when no external punishment is present. In this understanding, morality is not a set of rules imposed from the outside, but an ongoing inner dialogue. Each person carries within them a silent spectator, constantly observing and evaluating their behavior through the eyes of society. When actions align with shared expectations, people feel at ease. When they deviate, they experience unease, a shame, or self-reproach. These feelings require no activation. They are already woven into the fabric of mental life. This line of thought carries great significance because it lays the groundwork for understanding society as a self-forming order. If human beings possess the capacity for self-examination and sympathy, society does not need to rely entirely on coercive power to maintain order. Order can arise from the interaction of individuals who are trying to live in ways that are acceptable to one another. This is not an idealized picture, but a cautious observation. Such order is always fragile, yet it is real, and it has long existed in everyday life. Notably, Adam Smith began with morality, not because he dismissed economics, but because he understood that all ways of making a living unfold between human beings. No exchange is ever completely neutral. Every transaction carries expectations of fairness, of treatment, and of dignity. When those expectations are violated, even an efficient system becomes uncomfortable and harmful. To understand economics, therefore, one must first understand the quiet emotions that shape economic behavior. Here, Adam Smith offered a perspective very different from many later interpretations. Human beings are not portrayed as cold individuals who exist solely to maximize advantage. They are complex creatures who want more, yet fear being despised, who seek benefit, yet long to live rightly. It is precisely this tension that generates society's moral energy. When a person acts in their own interest in a way that clearly harms others, a sense of unease emerges, and that unease can outweigh the benefit gained. Seen from this angle, the theory of moral sentiments is not a separate chapter in Adam Smith's thought, but the ground upon which all his later ideas stand. It explains why people are able to cooperate without constant coercion. It also explains why societies that neglect dignity and sympathy, no matter how wealthy they become, remain vulnerable to crises of trust. When people no longer believe they are seen and judged fairly, they withdraw, resist, or grow indifferent, and the shared order begins to fracture. The subtlety of Adam Smith's thinking lies in his refusal to turn morality into a distant ideal. For him, morality resides in deeply human reactions. A frown in response to injustice, a feeling of discomfort when witnessing cruelty, a quiet satisfaction when one's actions are recognized. These emotions do not need to be perfect. They need only be strong enough to keep human beings from drifting too far apart. From here, a new direction gradually came into view. Having laid the foundation for understanding human beings as creatures capable of sympathy, Adam Smith began to ask, what happens when these moral sentiments enter the world of labor? When people not only live together but also work together, exchanging the products of their labor, what role do sympathy and the desire for recognition play? Can work become a space in which dignity is expressed? Or will it erode inner life if reduced to repetitive tasks alone? These questions opened a new chapter in Adam Smith's intellectual journey. From the inner life, his attention slowly turned toward labor, not as a heavy obligation, but as a central element of human existence where dignity, recognition, and moral sentiments collide directly with the way society is organized. And from there, the story continues, slowly yet irreversibly, into the relationship between work, human beings, and the meaning of making a living. As Adam Smith began to look more deeply into human life, he realized that no experience is more closely bound to personal dignity than labor. Work is not merely the means by which people earn a living. It is where they seek recognition, where they feel themselves to be useful, and where they place their own worth before the gaze of society. A person may endure poverty for a time, but it is far harder to accept being regarded as invisible. It is at this point that Adam Smith touched upon a fragile truth. People work not only to have more, but to be seen. In his thinking, labor was not a purely burdensome obligation. It was a social relationship. When someone produces something of value to others, they receive not only money in return, but also a confirmation that their existence matters. A society functions smoothly, not simply because transactions take place, but because every transaction carries an unspoken acknowledgement. I need you. It is this acknowledgement that allows people to stand upright in the world. Adam Smith saw clearly that dignity does not naturally arise from wealth. It comes from the feeling of participation, of contribution, and of being respected. A worker may not be wealthy, but if their work is regarded as necessary and worthy of respect, they can still retain their self-respect. By contrast, when labor is devalued, when people are treated as replaceable tools, even material abundance is insufficient to compensate for the feeling of being diminished. Here, Adam Smith did not romanticize labor as an ideal. He understood well the fatigue, monotony, and limits of repetitive work. Yet he also saw that even in the most ordinary tasks, people find their connection to society. A craftsman, a small trader, a modest laborer, all are indispensable links in a larger network. When one link is treated as worthless, the entire network comes under strain. What Adam Smith emphasized was not productivity, but recognition. People need to know that their work does not merely serve the interests of others, but is acknowledged by society as a legitimate contribution. When such recognition disappears, labor easily becomes an experience that erodes the spirit. People continue to work, but they do so with a sense of detachment, no longer feeling themselves to be part of something larger. From this perspective, Adam Smith began to understand why societies that disregard the dignity of labor eventually drift into instability. When people do not feel respected, they lose not only motivation but also trust. And when trust weakens, social relationships grow cold and fragile. Labor, instead of binding people together, becomes a source of quiet resentment. In Adam Smith's reflection, recognition does not require praise or grand rewards. Sometimes it is simply fairness in exchange, or not being treated as a mere means. A society that preserves these small things creates a sense of moral security, in which people can accept their own efforts, even when outcomes are imperfect. Conversely, when everything is measured solely by advantage, people gradually withdraw, working less with their hearts and more with resignation. Adam Smith also recognized that recognition does not come from a single source. It is shaped by countless gazes, by how society speaks about labor, by how relationships are organized. When work is placed within a moral context, one in which fairness, respect, and sympathy still have a place, people are able to endure more. But when that context disappears, even the most efficient work becomes heavy and exhausting. At its deepest level, this line of thought reveals that Adam Smith always placed human beings at the center. He did not separate labor from inner life. Making a living, in his understanding, was not merely an economic process, but part of a journey toward personal worth. When society allows people to see meaning in their work, it becomes more resilient, even if it remains imperfect. Yet alongside this understanding, a concern began to emerge. Adam Smith started to ask, what would happen when work was divided into such small parts that people could no longer see the full meaning of what they were doing? When each person performs only a narrow, repetitive task, does the sense of contribution and recognition still survive? And if not, what does labor, once a source of dignity, become? From this question, Adam Smith's thinking prepared him to move in a new direction. From viewing labor as a place where people find value, he gradually turned his attention to how society organizes work, and to the subtle consequences that such organization has for inner life. As people work together in increasingly specialized ways, what happens to their capacity to sense meaning, to feel recognition, and to the very dignity that labor once provided? These reflections open the door to another crucial observation, one in which labor not only binds people together, but can also quietly narrow them as well. Before Adam Smith wrote about wealth, he spent many years thinking about human beings. This was not a random choice, but the inevitable outcome of everything he had witnessed and experienced. Looking back on his intellectual journey, he understood that if one could not answer the question of who human beings are when they live together, then every economic theory would remain a cold, soulless diagram. Adam Smith's first book did not speak of markets, nor did it discuss profit or growth. It focused instead on deeply human feelings: sympathy, self-respect, shame, and the desire for recognition. For him, These were not peripheral elements of social life, but its foundation. Human beings do not enter exchange as calculating machines, but with a full range of emotions, expectations, and limits. To ignore this is to leave every account of society missing a crucial piece. Adam Smith understood that economics does not exist in empty space. It unfolds among people who carry memories, wounds, and a sense of dignity. A transaction is not merely an exchange of goods. It is also a silent encounter between two dignities. When one side feels diminished, the exchange, even if numerically fair, still leaves behind a residue of unease. That is why before asking how society generates wealth, he wanted to know how society treats human beings. Placing a book on moral sentiments first was not an evasion of economics, but an act of caution. Adam Smith seemed to foresee a danger. If one begins with interest, it is easy to conclude that human beings live only for interest. But if one begins with morality, one must acknowledge that interest is always filtered through social emotions. People may pursue what benefits them, but they rarely wish to be seen as unjust, cruel, or inhuman. Here, Adam Smith did not attempt to construct an idealized picture. He did not claim that people are always kind, nor that sympathy alone can resolve every conflict. What he sought to clarify was this: even in complex societies, where competition and difference are constant, there exist moral forces that prevent human beings from drifting too far apart. These forces are quiet, unwritten, and rarely acknowledged, yet they silently shape everyday behavior. For this reason, the book reads like a preparation. It does not offer solutions, but lays the groundwork for how questions should be asked. When Adam Smith wrote about moral sentiments, he was constructing a full portrait of the human being, someone who seeks to improve their condition, yet fears losing respect. That portrait would accompany him into all his later thinking, as a reminder that behind every number stands a concrete human life. A society may generate wealth rapidly, but if it erodes the capacity for sympathy, it will soon face fracture. Adam Smith saw this danger clearly. He understood that when people no longer feel they are seen and judged fairly, they cease to invest emotionally in shared life. They comply out of fear, or act only for immediate gain, and at that point, social order becomes more fragile than ever. By writing about morality first, Adam Smith placed an implicit boundary around all subsequent economic thought. This boundary was not a prohibition, but a reminder. Every system of making a living must answer the question of dignity. A system may be efficient, but if it makes people feel like mere instruments, that efficiency will be purchased at the cost of long-term instability. He did not oppose development, but he warned of the spiritual price development can exact when it lacks a moral foundation. The earlier book also came first for a more personal reason. Adam Smith had lived long enough with observations of everyday life to understand that what causes people suffering is not only material deprivation, but the feeling of being excluded from the community. A person may be poor, but if they are still respected, they retain trust. When that trust disappears, the surrounding wealth becomes meaningless. Writing about moral sentiments was Adam Smith's way of responding to those lived experiences, and it was within this quiet preparation that another door began to open. Once the foundation concerning human beings had been firmly laid, Adam Smith could take the next step, turning his attention to how people work together, not labor as an abstract concept, but as a sequence of concrete actions where skills are divided and coordination grows increasingly refined. When people enter the world of production and exchange with a moral foundation already formed, what happens then? From that question, Adam Smith's thinking gradually turned toward direct observation of working life. He did not abandon what he had written about moral sentiments. On the contrary, he carried those ideas with him like a compass, for only by understanding human beings in their emotional depth could he look squarely at how they work, exchange, and build society, without losing sight of what matters most, the meaning of making a living. When Adam Smith turned his gaze toward labor, he did not seek out numbers or abstract diagrams. He sought out people at work, not idealized figures, but craftsmen, traders, ordinary laborers, people who repeated familiar motions each day simply to sustain life. There, he did not see an anonymous force, but individuals with their own rhythms, with fatigue, hope, and a desire to be recognized. Adam Smith observed labor as a social phenomenon before viewing it as an economic process. He recognized that no one works in isolation. Every act of labor, no matter how small, is directed toward others. A craftsman produces goods that they themselves do not use. A trader gives up what they have in order to receive what they need. Labor, in this view, is a silent dialogue between human beings, in which each person contributes a small part to shared life. What drew Adam Smith's attention was not diligence alone, but coordination. Society functions not because it is filled with extraordinary individuals, but because ordinary people know how to rely on one another. No one needs to grasp the entire picture. It is enough to perform one's own task well. And from this web of connections, a larger order gradually emerges. This order is not designed by someone standing above it, but arises from countless individual actions seeking to adjust to one another. In this understanding, labor does more than produce wealth. It produces a connection. When a person completes their work, they send out a signal, "I am participating in our shared life." And when society responds by accepting the product of that labor, a circle of trust is completed. It is this circle that prevents people from falling into a sense of exclusion. Adam Smith understood that once this connection is lost, labor quickly becomes a meaningless burden. He also recognized that labor carries with it a very subtle form of recognition. No praise is required, no titles are needed. The mere fact that one's product is used and exchanged is enough for the worker to feel they have a place. This is a quiet form of dignity, yet a durable one. When society disrupts this recognition, when labor is treated as something easily discarded or replaced without regard, people begin to withdraw. They continue to work, but no longer feel connected. Adam Smith paid close attention to small differences in working life. Some kinds of work allow people to see the full outcome of their effort. Other kinds show them only a narrow fragment of a larger process. This difference affects not only productivity, but inner life. When people no longer clearly understand what they are contributing to, a sense of meaning gradually fades. Work continues, but the bond with the community grows faint. In these observations, Adam Smith did not rush to judgment. He neither condemned nor idealized. He simply noted that the way society organizes labor profoundly shapes how people experience themselves. A society may function efficiently, but if it causes workers to feel invisible, that efficiency carries a quiet cost, one that cannot be measured in money. Adam Smith also noticed a seeming paradox. The more society develops, the more specialized labor becomes, and the more easily people lose sight of the whole. This is not always harmful. Specialization allows society to produce more and more quickly. Yet it also creates a risk. individuals may be narrowed into roles so small that they forget they are part of something larger. Here, Adam Smith began to sense a deep tension. On one hand, he saw the immense potential of coordinated labor. On the other hand, he clearly perceived the spiritual risk when work is divided into finely. If a person repeats the same motion day after day, can they still retain the vitality of thought and feeling? And if not, what must society face as the number of such exhausted individuals grows? These questions did not lead Adam Smith to reject progress. On the contrary, they made him more cautious. He understood that observing labor is not only about how people create wealth, but about how they become human through their work. Labor can sustain dignity, but it can also erode it, depending on how society arranges and evaluates it. As he followed the flow of labor within society, Adam Smith recognized a crucial point. Not all forms of coordination are equally natural. Some forms make people feel necessary. Others make them feel like mere cogs. And this difference determines whether labor becomes a source of connection or a source of distance. From these quiet observations, Adam Smith's thinking gradually moved toward a more central concept. If labor is the foundation of social life, then the way it is shared and distributed will shape the form of that society. When work is divided into smaller parts, for the sake of efficiency, what happens to the people who perform those parts? How far can refined coordination elevate shared life? And at the same time, what marks does it leave on individual lives? These reflections opened a new direction. From observing people at work, Adam Smith prepared to delve more deeply into how society organizes labor, where an idea both powerful and far-reaching began to take shape. There, the division of work promised unprecedented efficiency, yet also raised unavoidable questions about the limits of human beings when they are narrowed within the confines of their own labor. There is an idea in Adam Smith's thought that is at once so simple it seems obvious and yet so profound that it has quietly shaped the modern world: the division of labor. It does not appear as a slogan or a grand declaration. It reveals itself through ordinary scenes, working hands, repeated motions, people standing side by side, each holding only a small part of the entire process. And then from those small parts, something remarkable occurs. Society produces more, faster, and with greater precision, as if collective power were amplified without anyone issuing commands. Adam Smith did not view the division of labor as a cold machine. He saw it as a form of silent cooperation among ordinary people. When one person does not have to do everything, they can do one thing better. When someone does not have to spend the day shifting between many skills, they can refine a single skill to mastery. And when many people specialize in different parts of a task, the final outcome becomes richer and more abundant, not only for those who produce it, but for the entire community. In Smith's observation, the division of labor does not begin with an ambition to become wealthy. It begins with a very human need: to save time and effort. A worker learns to act more quickly because they repeat the same task. A group learns to coordinate because no one can do everything alone. And it is this repetition, when embedded within a stable social network, that produces something almost magical. Productivity increases not merely because muscles work harder, but because the mind discovers more efficient ways of doing things. Behind the division of labor, there is always something quietly present: attention, habit, and the capacity to improve small details. What makes Adam Smith's account compelling is that he never turns the division of labor into a distant abstraction. He often begins with simple examples allowing the listener to feel the idea for themselves. When a task is divided into steps, and each person takes responsibility for one step, the whole process flows more smoothly. Society here resembles a piece of music, where each instrument plays only its part, yet together they create a complete melody. No one needs to see the entire score for music to emerge. Each person simply needs to keep their own rhythm. Yet within the beauty of this coordination, Adam Smith also perceived a deeper layer. The division of labor does not merely change how production happens, it changes how people understand themselves. When a person performs many different tasks, they may feel flexible and whole, able to see connections across life. When a person performs a single task for too long, they may become extraordinarily skilled within a narrow range, but at the same time risk losing breadth of thought. Smith did not rush to condemn this, but he was perceptive enough to see that efficiency can come with a quiet cost. For this reason, the division of labor in Adam Smith's thought is not merely a mechanism for creating wealth. It is a force that shapes society. It establishes a new rhythm of life, one in which people depend on one another more deeply, because no one makes everything alone. It also creates an invisible bond. In order to survive, each person must trust that others will do their part. Specialization makes society more productive, but it also makes it more fragile if trust begins to fracture. What gives this section its strength is its balance. The wonder of cooperation is acknowledged without ignoring human limits. Adam Smith allows us to feel that the division of labor can be a great gift, making society more abundant, reducing scarcity, and expanding the choices available in life. But he also raises a question. If people are narrowed into repetitive operations, what happens to inner life, to curiosity, to the sense of being a whole human being? At the deepest level, the division of labor also reshapes the meaning of making a living. Earning a living is no longer tied to a single, comprehensive skill or a familiar space. It becomes a position within a vast network, where a person's value is determined by whether they can contribute a stable link. This can create an opportunity for many because mastering even a small part allows participation in shared life. But it can also make a person feel small and replaceable if society fails to provide the recognition they need. From here, Adam Smith moved closer to a crucial realization. The division of labor cannot exist without exchange. When each person performs only a part, they must rely on others for the rest. And when mutual dependence becomes the rule, exchange is no longer a choice. It is a condition of life. Not everyone is conscious of this, but modern society is built upon it. We live through the labor of countless people we will never meet. Thus, almost immediately after grasping the power of the division of labor, another door opened, the door of exchange, the force that binds scattered tasks into a living society. When people no longer make everything themselves, they must step beyond their own sphere, place the products of their labor into the hands of others, and receive in return what they need to continue living. From this point on, coordination is no longer confined to workshops or small groups. It spreads across society as a whole, forming a network so vast that we often forget we are living within it. There was a moment in human history when no one stood up to declare, "From now on, everything will be different." There were no drums, no banners, no official day of remembrance, yet it happened, quietly and persistently, each time a person passed something they possessed into another's hands in exchange for what they needed. Exchange, an act that seems small, became the invisible thread that stitched modern society together. And it was here that Adam Smith most clearly perceived the deep movement of life itself. Once labor had been divided, once each person held only a portion of the work, exchange was no longer a choice. It became a condition of existence. A craftsman might be highly skilled at producing one kind of good, but could not create everything required for life. They needed food from farmers, tools from other artisans, clothing, shelter, and countless things they could not make themselves. Exchange, therefore, was not merely a matter of buying and selling. It was the way human beings acknowledged their mutual dependence. What Adam Smith saw in exchange was not only the flow of goods. He saw a truth about social nature itself. Human beings cannot live alone, and they must constantly find ways to weave personal needs into a shared network. Exchange carried life beyond the boundaries of family, village, and birthplace. It expanded each individual's world. A person need not know the face of the one who made the item they use, yet they live by that person's effort. And within this very anonymity, a new kind of order took shape, an order of connections that did not require familiarity. Exchange transformed how people understood value. Before, many things were valuable because they directly served the survival of the person who made them. But as exchange became widespread, value grew increasingly social. An object had worth because others needed it and were willing to offer something in return. Individual life thus became tightly bound to the perceptions and needs of others. No one lived entirely by their own rhythm anymore. People entered a space where needs, desires, and capacities intertwined. What is striking in Adam Smith's approach is that he did not portray exchange as a game of greed. He saw it as a mechanism that compelled people to learn how to interact in predictable ways. If exchange is to endure, deception cannot be constant. Trust becomes the foundation. Reputation becomes a kind of invisible asset. And fairness, however imperfect, must be maintained to some degree if relationships are not to collapse. Exchange, therefore, does more than generate wealth. It also produces norms of behavior. As exchange spread, it altered even the sense of home in human life. Previously, making a living was closely tied to place, land, fields, familiar communities. But as exchange opened wider networks, people increasingly made a living by participating in flows that extended beyond the local. One could live by relying on people far away and sell products to those one has never met. This was a form of liberation, but also a new kind of loneliness. Dependence became vast, while familiarity diminished. It was precisely this transformation that made exchange feel both like an opening door and a closing one. It opened opportunities. People were no longer bound solely to their place of birth, could access more goods, and could work within systems larger than themselves. Yet it also closed off an older sense of security, the feeling that everyone around you knew who you were, and that your existence was directly recognized. Within the vast network of exchange, people could become anonymous. And when anonymity grows, recognition, the nourishment of dignity, can become fragile. Exchange also confronted human beings with a new reality of time. In a self-sufficient life, rhythm followed seasons and nature. But as exchange developed, rhythm shifted toward markets, demand, and the movement of goods. People began to live by external signals, prices, opportunities, scarcity, and abundance. These are not inherently harmful, yet they make life easier to be swept along, easier to exhaust, because adaptation becomes constant. Perhaps the most profound change brought by exchange was in how people understood themselves within society. When a person exchanges the product of their labor for what they need, they are making a simple statement: I can create value. But that statement only holds meaning when another person affirms it through exchange. In this way, exchange becomes a form of social language. It confirms one's position within the shared network. And when exchange is interrupted, when a person can no longer participate, they lose not only income, but often the feeling of belonging itself. Here, Adam Smith perceived a deep paradox. Exchange makes society stronger and wealthier, yet it also renders questions of dignity more urgent. If a person can no longer exchange, how will they be regarded? If human worth becomes too tightly bound to the capacity to participate in markets, how will society treat those who grow old, weak, or weary? These questions did not yet demand immediate answers, but they began to arise once exchange moved to the center of life. And it was in that moment that a new meaning of making a living slowly emerged. Making a living was no longer simply about finding food and shelter. It became the ability to participate in networks of exchange, the ability to be recognized by society through one's work and its products. Exchange changed everything, not only material conditions, but also how people felt their own worth. From here, the current of thought flowed toward a deeper question. If exchange has expanded life so profoundly, how has it altered the meaning of making a living in the human mind? In a society organized around exchange, do people still see work as fate? Or do they begin to see it as a capacity that can be chosen and changed? And where do the vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, the exhausted stand within such a network? These questions lead us to a new layer of meaning, where making a living is no longer self-evident, but becomes a concept that must be re-examined through a more humane lens. There is a concern in Adam Smith's thought that is often overlooked, because it does not fit the simplified image people like to attach to him. When Smith is mentioned, many think of wealth, of markets, of the invisible hand, and of the productive machines of a world moving forward. Yet in his quiet observations, alongside his confidence in the power of cooperation, there was always another question, darker and more deeply human. What happens to people when their work becomes too narrow? The division of labor, in Smith's view, is like a blade that is both sharp and dangerous. It enables society to generate wealth, makes material life more abundant, and opens opportunities for many to participate in a vast network of livelihoods. But precisely because work is divided so finely that each person performs only a fragment, human beings themselves can be narrowed by that fragment. When someone spends a lifetime repeating a single operation, they may become exceptionally skilled at it, yet gradually slow in other capacities. Broad thinking, subtle perception, curiosity, and self-reflection. Adam Smith did not present this as a lament about modern times. He observed it as a psychological transformation. Work, when broad enough, can nourish people. It gives them a sense of agency, allows them to see the results of their effort, and offers pride. But work that becomes too narrow, when the final outcome always lies beyond the worker's sight, can turn into a weary form of existence. People still work, still complete tasks, still receive wages, yet an emptiness slowly appears within. What am I contributing to, and who am I beyond this job? Here, Smith touched upon a delicate truth. Society may become more efficient, but the people within it do not necessarily become happier. Efficiency creates a rhythm that is fast, steady, and precise. But that rhythm can also render inner life monotonous. When each day is a copy of the last, When the mind is no longer challenged by new questions, it can contract, like a muscle used only for a single motion. Adam Smith's concern was not only about the narrowing of intellect, it was about wounded dignity. For dignity does not come merely from having work, but from the feeling of being a whole human being. If a person is reduced to a small, replaceable part, they gradually cease to feel seen as an individual. And when that feeling spreads, society faces a new kind of poverty. Not poverty of money, but poverty of inner life, of the capacity for independent thought and self-respect. What makes Adam Smith's perspective so valuable is that he did not see workers as numbers within a system. He saw them as real human beings with inner lives, limits, and a need to learn and to be recognized. For this reason, when he warned against work becoming too narrow, it was not a complaint against the division of labor itself. It was a reminder that any system that prioritizes output while forgetting people will generate, and a sense that people are seen as human beings, not as instruments. Here, Adam Smith's subtlety lies in his view of making a living as part of moral life. Earning one's living cannot be separated from the question of how society judges human beings. If the only standard is productivity and profit, then sooner or later those who can no longer keep pace will be regarded as burdens. But if society preserves some measure of sympathy and recognition, making a living can become a humanizing journey. People work not only to survive, but to feel that they matter, and to recognize that same worth in others. The new meaning of making a living, therefore, carries both light and shadow. The light is the possibility of escaping old destinies, of learning a skill, entering a broader network, and finding one's place through ability. The shadow is the ease with which people can be measured, reduced, and confined to a single definition. How much are you worth? Adam Smith, in his caution, did not deny the light. But neither did he turn away from the shadow. He sought to remind us that any system that causes people to forget one another's dignity creates a new kind of poverty, a poverty of the spirit. And then, as the meaning of making a living expanded in this way, another image gradually emerged in Adam Smith's thought, the image of an unseen regulating force. For if millions of people pursue their livelihoods, exchange with one another, and seek their own footing, what prevents all this movement from dissolving into chaos? Why is it that from countless individual choices, society can still produce a form of order? When people are not compelled to perform a single assigned role, yet are still able to coordinate their lives together, might there be some invisible mechanism at work? It is precisely here that the stream of thought prepares to enter a concept so often misunderstood, so often invoked as a mantra for greed, but in Adam Smith's own work carried a far simpler meaning. Each person attends to their own part, and society, within certain limits, regulates itself. Not a miracle, not a justification for cruelty, but a way of describing how order can arise from ordinary life. And as we step through that doorway, we begin to approach the image most often associated with his name, the invisible hand, this time seen through a more humane, slower, and more cautious lens. Perhaps no image associated with Adam Smith is as famous and as widely misunderstood as the phrase, the invisible hand. It has been turned into a convenient slogan to explain everything. Markets regulate themselves. If everyone looks after their own interests, society will improve, and greed, strangely enough, becomes the engine of progress. Yet if we pause for a moment and look more closely at how Adam Smith actually observed life, we see that the invisible hand in his thinking is neither a divine miracle nor a talisman for irresponsibility. It is closer to a gentle way of describing a phenomenon he recognized early on. Order can arise from very ordinary actions. Adam Smith lived in an age when power was typically understood as something that flowed from above. Kings commanded, churches instructed, privileged classes decided. In many domains, this was true. But when he looked at how people made a living, at labor, exchange, and vast networks of trade that no one fully controlled, he perceived a different kind of order. It did not require a central commander. It emerged from countless individual decisions. A craftsman choosing to produce what they did best. A merchant bringing goods where demand existed. A buyer selecting what fit their means. No one intended to create a perfect system, yet the system appeared nonetheless, like a tapestry woven from millions of small threads. What matters is that Adam Smith did not describe this phenomenon with blind praise. He observed it as one watches a river, seeing its flow, its bends, its clear waters and its murky currents alike. The invisible hand was his way of speaking about unseen guidance, where self-interested actions, under certain conditions, could lead to outcomes that were not entirely selfish. A person sells goods to survive, but to sell them, they must meet the needs of others. Someone seeks profit, but to secure it over time, they must preserve their reputation and avoid shattering trust. Even when the initial motive is personal, the path to fulfillment runs through the lives of others. For this reason, the invisible hand is not advice to think only of oneself. It is a reminder that in society, people rarely achieve their own benefit without touching the lives of others. And it is precisely this interdependence that creates natural limits on behavior. Not always fair, not always gentle, but sufficient to explain why society does not collapse into immediate chaos in the absence of someone controlling every detail. The most common misunderstanding arises when the invisible hand is treated as an absolute belief. Leave everything alone, and the market will heal all wounds. Adam Smith did not inhabit such a naive world. He wrote about morality before he wrote about markets, not because he lacked interest in economics, but because he understood that no system functions well without an adequate moral and institutional foundation. The certain conditions under which the invisible hand might operate are often omitted in simplified quotations. In Adam Smith's humanistic view, the invisible hand can function only relatively well when people retain some capacity for sympathy, when society values reputation, when minimal laws protect trust, and when competition is not distorted by privilege. If a small group gains the power to manipulate outcomes, if injustice becomes normalized, if greed is no longer constrained by shame or moral judgment, then the invisible hand ceases to guide and instead becomes a blind force, pulling people farther and farther apart. What keeps Adam Smith's approach compelling is that he refused to stand at either extreme. He did not believe society needed to control everything like a machine, but neither did he believe society could simply abandon itself to chance. He was a cautious observer, attentive to the power of free exchange, yet always mindful that such freedom must coexist with dignity. Markets can generate wealth and open opportunities, but they do not generate decency on their own. And when society confuses self-regulation with irresponsibility, the cost is usually borne by the most vulnerable. At a deeper level, re-examining the invisible hand also means re-examining the meaning of making a living. When people rely on markets to survive, they become part of a current larger than themselves. This brings opportunity, but also anxiety. For if order arises from countless individual decisions, an individual may feel small and easily swept away. And if society tells them only that the market will take care of it, without offering moral protection or education, they will soon feel abandoned. That is why when speaking of the invisible hand, what matters most is not a slogan, but an attitude. The attitude of viewing society as a living system in which individual actions can generate order, yet where that order is always fragile and must be supported by things that cannot be measured in money, trust, honor, and recognition. And once that image is reconsidered with sufficient care, another shadow begins to come into view. As society increasingly relies on specialization and exchange, human work itself becomes ever more narrowly defined. A person may perform a task with extreme efficiency, yet that very efficiency can slowly erode inner life. Adam Smith did not merely describe the invisible hand guiding the flow of society. He also noticed where that flow created whirlpools, where people were pulled into repetitive rhythms of labor until they forgot that they were larger than their work. From here, a quiet concern began to take hold in his thinking. What happens when work becomes too narrow? When people become experts in a single small operation, and when the mind contracts like a room long kept closed? It is this concern that would lead him toward another observation, one in which efficiency is no longer the only story, and where human dignity is once again placed at the center of the scale. There is a concern in Adam Smith's thought that is often overlooked because it does not fit the simplified image people like to attach to him. When Smith is mentioned, many think of wealth, of markets, of the invisible hand, and of the productive machines of a world moving forward. Yet in his quiet observations, alongside his confidence in the power of cooperation, there was always another question, darker and more deeply human. What happens to people when their work becomes too narrow? The division of labor, in Smith's view, is like a blade that is both sharp and dangerous. It enables society to generate wealth, makes material life more abundant, and opens opportunities for many to participate in a vast network of livelihoods. But precisely because work is divided so finely that each person performs only a fragment, human beings themselves can be narrowed by that fragment. When someone spends a lifetime repeating a single operation, they may become exceptionally skilled at it, yet gradually slow in other capacities. Broad thinking, subtle perception, curiosity, and self-reflection. Adam Smith did not present this as a lament about modern times. He observed it as a psychological transformation. Work, when broad enough, can nourish people. It gives them a sense of agency, allows them to see the results of their effort, and offers pride. But work that becomes too narrow, when the final outcome always lies beyond the worker's sight, can turn into a weary form of existence. People still work, still complete tasks, still receive wages, yet an emptiness slowly appears within. What am I contributing to, and who am I beyond this job? Here, Smith touched upon a delicate truth. Society may become more efficient, but the people within it do not necessarily become happier. Efficiency creates a rhythm that is fast, steady, and precise. But that rhythm can also render inner life monotonous. When each day is a copy of the last, when the mind is no longer challenged by new questions, it can contract, like a muscle used only for a single motion. Adam Smith's concern was not only about the narrowing of intellect, it was about wounded dignity. For dignity does not come merely from having work, but from the feeling of being a whole human being. If a person is reduced to a small, replaceable part, they gradually cease to feel seen as an individual. And when that feeling spreads, society faces a new kind of poverty. Not poverty of money, but poverty of inner life, of the capacity for independent thought and self-respect. What makes Adam Smith's perspective so valuable is that he did not see workers as numbers within a system. He saw them as real human beings with inner lives, limits, and a need to learn and to be recognized. For this reason, when he warned against work becoming too narrow, it was not a complaint against the division of labor itself. It was a reminder that any system that prioritizes output while forgetting people will generate long-term consequences that no balance sheet can measure. In his deeper reflections, overly narrow work also alters how people relate to society. When they no longer understand the full meaning of the labor they perform, they easily lose a sense of belonging. They no longer see themselves as part of shared life, but as standing outside it, performing a motion merely to receive payment. And when labor becomes a purely transactional act, recognition, the thread that binds dignity, grows fragile. A worker may feel abandoned, even in the midst of a crowd. This narrowing also tends to produce a fatigue that is difficult to name. Not the fatigue of doing too much, but the fatigue of living within a loop that no longer opens toward a meaningful future. A person may endure material hardship, but it is far harder to endure the feeling of being boxed in. And when that feeling persists, it creates a society filled with silent people, not because they lack voices, but because they no longer believe their voices matter. Here, Adam Smith returns to the starting point of his moral thinking. If society wishes to be durable, it cannot rely on exchange and efficiency alone. It must preserve enough breadth in human life for people to remain human, and this does not happen automatically. A specialized system of labor may generate wealth, but to protect people from being narrowed by it, society needs something more: education, morality, and mechanisms that safeguard dignity. Seen from a distance, Adam Smith's warning resembles a quiet message addressed to the modern world. A society may advance to the point where everything is optimized, but if the human beings within it become smaller, that progress comes at too high a cost, and that cost is most often borne by those with the fewest choices. The poor, monotonous workers, the elderly growing weary, and those no longer able to reinvent themselves according to the market's demands. For this reason, from his observation of work that becomes too narrow, the current of thought naturally leads toward a more specific group of people, those who suffer most when labor becomes the primary measure of value. When society is organized around productivity and specialization, who is left behind? Who will be cared for, and who will be treated as a burden? These questions open a quieter space, where Adam Smith no longer looks at mechanisms, but at faces: the poor, the elderly, and those who are tired. There is a dimension of Adam Smith's legacy that is often obscured by overly famous keywords: markets, wealth, the invisible hand. Yet if we look closely at the human depth of his thought, we see that his gaze consistently turned toward those who were least visible. Not the winners of the race, but those standing at its margins: the poor, the elderly, and the weary. Here, Adam Smith does not speak in tones of accusation, nor does he cloak himself in moral slogans. He simply poses an unsettling question: how does a society that worships productivity treat those who no longer have the strength to be useful in the market sense? In a world where labor is fragmented and measured by efficiency, people are easily defined by their capacity to produce exchangeable value. When they are young, healthy, and quick, They can participate in that network and receive recognition in return. But life is not a straight line. There are stages when strength fades, bodies slow, and spirits grow tired. There are days when people still rise in the morning, still wish to live decently, yet no longer have the energy to keep pace with society's rotation. And at that point, the question is no longer, how do I become wealthy, but where do I still belong? Adam Smith understood very clearly the danger of allowing the market to become the sole measure. Markets may be skilled at pricing goods, but they are profoundly poor at valuing human dignity. If a society comes to see the poor as problems, the elderly as burdens, and the weary as failures, then it is quietly cutting away its own humanity. Most frightening of all, this cutting away need not arise from malice. It can occur simply because people grow accustomed to viewing everything through the lens of efficiency. The poor, in Adam Smith's reflections, are not abstract shadows. They are people who have tried, who have worked, yet still found themselves unable to stand securely. Perhaps they were born where opportunities were scarce. Perhaps they lacked education. Perhaps they were trapped in work so narrow that their skills could never expand. Poverty is not merely a lack of money. It is also a lack of access to what allows people to lift themselves: knowledge, time, protection, and the sense that they have not been abandoned. The elderly, within this picture, make the question even deeper, for old age is a reality no one escapes. A society may celebrate youth, speed, and competition, yet everyone eventually reaches a day when the body no longer responds as it once did. When work ends, what remains to affirm one's value? If a person has been taught throughout life that worth lies in productivity, then what emptiness awaits when productivity disappears? Adam Smith seems to have perceived that loneliness very early on, the loneliness of those whom society no longer needs in an economic sense. And there is another group, less often named yet deeply familiar to modern life: the exhausted. Not exhausted from idleness, but worn down by repetition, by constant adaptation, by relentless measurement, by the awareness that one may be replaced at any moment. This exhaustion is not merely a personal problem. It is a signal from a system that has begun to forget that human beings are not machines. In his humanistic depth, Adam Smith did not propose a world in which everyone is cared for without contributing. He did not advocate passivity, but he consistently emphasized that society exists not only to generate wealth, but to create a shared life that remains livable for human beings at every stage. A society with no place for the weak will sooner or later become unstable, because it sows fear even among the strong, the fear that one day they too will be cast aside. The most important element here is the return of moral feeling. What Adam Smith laid down at the beginning, sympathy, the desire for recognition, self-examination, now becomes the measure of an economic system. It is not that markets are wrong. It is that markets are insufficient. They must be surrounded by what they cannot produce on their own: education to protect minds from narrowing, laws to restrain privilege and exploitation, and a culture that sees the elderly, the poor, and the weary as human beings rather than system errors. There is a particular persuasive power in placing the poor and the elderly at the center of reflection, for it exposes what everyone knows yet few say aloud. An economy is not only the story of the successful, it is also the story of those left behind. And a society is judged not by the speed at which it generates wealth, but by how it treats those who no longer have the strength to run. From here, the current of thought moves toward a necessary assertion. If Adam Smith cared about the weary, then he could never agree with a version of capitalism used to justify cruelty. He did not write to celebrate greed. He wrote to describe a system that could function if kept within moral limits. And when society forgets this, when his name is invoked as an excuse to legitimize indifference, what must be done is to return to him a clearer statement. This system was never designed to be cruel. There are names that, over time, become simplified into symbols far more reduced than the people they once represented. Adam Smith is one such name. He is often invoked as the father of capitalism, and from there, all the harshness of the modern world, inequality, exploitation, indifference, human beings measured by productivity, is conveniently laid at his feet like a ready-made verdict. Yet if we slow down and look more carefully, what emerges is not a champion of greed, but a cautious intellect that began with morality and consistently carried a concern for human dignity. Thus, when we say that capitalism was never designed to be cruel, we are not offering elegant words in defense of a system. We are restoring fairness to Adam Smith himself. He described a mechanism capable of generating prosperity, but only when it was kept within moral limits. In Smith's thinking, the market is not a cathedral of profit. It resembles a space of exchange, where human beings depend on one another to survive. If a person wishes to make a living, they must produce what others need, maintain their reputation, and respect the unwritten rules of fairness. Seen in this light, the market is not a stage for absolute indifference. It is a place where people are compelled to see one another, even if only in pursuit of their own goals. And it is precisely this interdependence that prevented Smith from ever equating self-interest with cruelty. The most important point is that Adam Smith never severed the economics from morality. Before writing about the wealth of nations, he wrote about sympathy, self-respect, and the invisible spectator within the human mind. The force that restrains individuals and leads them to wish to be seen as decent people. A person may pursue advantage, but they rarely wish to be regarded as inhuman. And if a society encourages them to forget that, it does not merely transform its economy, it transforms its people. For this reason, the cruelty we observe in certain versions of modern capitalism is not something Adam Smith designed or celebrated. It typically appears when the moral dimension of his thought is stripped away, leaving behind only a convenient fragment. Let the market take care of it. But markets cannot take care of dignity. They are effective at allocating goods, but ineffective at protecting the vulnerable. They respond quickly to profit, but slowly to pain. And when society abandons everything to them, what emerges is not natural order, but a distortion of order, one in which those unable to compete are treated as if they no longer matter. Adam Smith clearly perceived this danger. He warned of repetitive work that narrows the mind. He cared about the poor, the elderly, and the weary. He understood that a society can grow richer while simultaneously becoming colder. And when it grows cold, those at the margins feel the chill first. These observations were not decorative footnotes. They are evidence that he never regarded the market as a moral deity, but as a tool that must be situated within a humane context. So why has capitalism become associated with cruelty? Perhaps because it is easily misunderstood as a license for indifference. That's the market. That's competition. Those are the rules. But Adam Smith never allowed such phrases to become excuses for moral abdication. He did not claim that self-interest automatically produces good outcomes. He merely observed that under certain conditions, when minimal laws exist, when competition is not distorted by privilege, when people retain a sense of shame and self-respect, individual actions can contribute to a shared order. When those conditions disappear, the invisible hand no longer guides. It becomes little more than a pleasing name for chaos dressed up as legitimacy. For this reason, revisiting Adam Smith is like revisiting a warning. If society wishes to use markets to create prosperity, it must preserve the human element within human beings. Efficiency cannot be the sole standard. Dignity cannot be measured by productivity. Labor cannot be treated as something disposable, and the vulnerable cannot be blamed for their weakness. An economic system is sustainable only when it does not force people to abandon their humanity in order to survive within it. At a deeper level, the phrase, "never designed to be cruel," also reframes the meaning of making a living. If earning one's livelihood becomes a race without rest, it will erode the moral sentiments that Adam Smith regarded as the foundation of society. When people are too exhausted, they lack the strength to feel sympathy. When they are too afraid of falling behind, they lack the calm required for fairness. At that point, markets may continue to function, but society will gradually lose its cohesion, something no amount of money can purchase. Therefore, the lesson to be drawn is not a rhetorical defense of capitalism, but a quiet reminder. Adam Smith did not grant anyone permission to be cruel. He described a mechanism and placed beside it moral limits that later generations have often ignored. To speak fairly of his legacy is to acknowledge that he was not only concerned with creating wealth, but also with protecting human beings from prosperity itself when it becomes indifferent. And once this is recognized, the next question becomes unavoidable. What must society do to prevent systems of livelihood from sliding into cruelty? If markets do not generate morality on their own, where does morality come from? Who bears responsibility for sustaining it? Here, Adam Smith directs attention to something unglamorous yet essential: education, and with it, the shared responsibility of society to protect people from being narrowed, abandoned, or reduced to mere instruments. From there, the journey moves into a quieter terrain, where solutions lie not in slogans, but in the patient construction of enduring foundations, knowledge, sympathy, and moral norms strong enough to uphold a shared life. There are elements of social life that cannot be bought with money, nor can they arise automatically simply because markets function. Education, morality, and shared responsibility belong to this category. They resemble the foundations of a house. When they are solid, they are rarely mentioned. When cracks appear, every sound on the floor suddenly becomes unsettling. Adam Smith, though often remembered primarily as a figure associated with markets and wealth, devoted a significant portion of his concern to precisely these foundations. For he understood a very simple truth. If a society knows only how to generate wealth, but not how to nurture human beings, that wealth will sooner or later turn into a cold form of pressure. In Adam Smith's view, markets can produce efficiency, but they do not produce character. They can allocate goods, but they do not teach people how to be decent, how to keep their word, or how to respect one another when interests collide. And when labor is divided so finely that people are narrowed by their work, the only thing that can protect them from that narrowing is not greater competition, but an expansion of the mind. Education, therefore, is not merely about doing work better. It is about preserving the liveliness of thought, sustaining the ability to understand others, and retaining the capacity to see oneself as more than an economic role. Adam Smith perceived early on a serious danger. When work becomes too narrow, the human mind can grow weary and monotonous. A society may achieve high productivity, yet be filled with people who have little time or energy left for curiosity, for broad thinking, or for moral self-examination. And when the capacity for self-examination weakens, what easily remains is rigidity, indifference, or a form of self-protection through numbness. At that point, morality is no longer an abstract ideal. It becomes a condition for preventing society from sliding into cruelty. Morality, in Adam Smith's spirit, is not a set of rigid commandments. It is the capacity for sympathy, the feeling of shame when doing wrong, and the self-respect that keep people from wanting to become inhuman. But these sentiments are not always naturally resilient. They must be cultivated by culture, by education, and by the ways in which society treats people. A society that continually worships profit and speed will, sooner or later, wear down these moral sentiments, much as a steady current slowly erodes stone. For this reason, Adam Smith could never accept the idea that simply leaving things alone would make everything better. He understood that markets require a moral environment in order to function without causing excessive harm. And that environment does not arise on its own. It demands shared responsibility, not the responsibility of isolated individuals, but of society as a whole, in creating the minimum conditions that prevent people from being left behind. Here, education is not meant only for elites. If only a small group is educated and mentally expanded, while the majority remains trapped in repetitive labor and deprived of opportunity, society will fracture in dangerous ways. Those with knowledge will gain ever greater capacity to direct their lives. Those without it will be increasingly swept along. As that gap widens, shared morality also fractures, because people no longer understand or trust one another. Adam Smith saw that a durable society requires a level of universal education sufficient for people to examine themselves, judge fairly, and possess the language to express injustice without turning it into violence. Shared responsibility, in this picture, is not charity. It is an acknowledgement that society is a web of mutual dependence. The strong today may be weak tomorrow. The wealthy today may fall in a sudden upheaval. If a society knows only how to reward winners and abandon losers, it plants a foundational fear in everyone. The fear of being discarded when one is no longer useful. That fear causes people to withdraw, erodes sympathy, and ultimately makes society cold. Such a system may function, but it is difficult to call it livable. Adam Smith, in his caution, did not deny the role of individual motivation. He simply insisted that individual motivation must be surrounded by a shared foundation, laws that protect trust, education that protects the mind, and morality that protects dignity. When these layers of protection exist, markets can become spaces of exchange that generate prosperity. When they disappear, markets easily turn into blind races in which people quietly wear one another down. What makes this line of thought most convincing is that it rests not on sentiment, but on deep observation of social psychology. Human beings cannot endure for long in environments where they are constantly measured as instruments. They will respond, in one way or another, by withdrawing, becoming indifferent, growing angry, or sinking into despair. And when such reactions accumulate, society pays the price through instability, loss of trust, and fractures that economic growth alone cannot mend. Thus, education, morality, and shared responsibility in Adam Smith are not decorative additions to an economic system. They are conditions that prevent the system from becoming cruel. They are what allow human beings to remain expansive enough to live as humans, rather than merely exist as units of production. Seen in this light, Adam Smith's legacy appears differently. He did not write only to explain how societies become wealthy, but to remind us that a society is truly valuable only when it does not make people smaller. From here, the current of thought naturally flows toward a broader picture. When education and morality become pillars of shared life, the question is no longer merely, how does an individual make a living, but what does a world built on these observations look like? Adam Smith's ideas moved beyond his desk, seeping into the ways people organize work, markets, states, and social responsibility. And the remarkable thing is this: even if not everyone knows his name, almost everyone is living within the consequences of what he once observed. There are legacies that do not reside in monuments or commemorative days. They live in the things we do every day without asking why. A hurried breakfast bought on a street corner, a tap to make a payment, a delivery arriving at the door, a job tied to a market wage, a decision to change careers for a better opportunity. In many ways, the modern world is built from such rhythms. And if we step back to see the whole, Adam Smith appears not as a prominent figure, but as an invisible framework. His observations have become society's habits. He did not build factories or invent machines. He did not sign treaties or command armies. What he did was look very closely at things that seemed small: how people work, how they exchange, why they can still coordinate even when no one controls the whole. From these observations, a picture of socio-economic life gradually emerged. Society is not only power and command, but countless agreements, countless interactions, countless moments in which people must take one another into account. Today's world, with all its rails and lines, still runs on that logic. Think of the simplest object in your room: a pen, a shirt, a phone, a sheet of paper. We rarely know all the hands that touched it before it reached us. Perhaps a cotton grower, a weaver, a designer, a transporter, a retailer. Each person performs only a small part, yet when those parts are assembled, a finished object appears. This is the world of the division of labor and exchange that Adam Smith recognized very early on. He offered a way to understand why wealth is not merely gold or silver, but society's capacity to coordinate. And from that capacity for coordination, a new meaning of making a living emerges. Many people today no longer earn their living by doing everything themselves. They earn it by becoming a reliable link in a network larger than themselves. The labor market, for all its instability, still rests on a core idea. Skills can be exchanged, jobs can move, and a person's value can be recognized by society through the goods or services they create. This both opens opportunities and generates anxiety, precisely as Adam Smith quietly anticipated when he wrote about dignity, recognition, and those who are easily left behind. Adam Smith's legacy is also present in how we speak about policy and the state, even when his name is not mentioned. When people debate free trade, competition, or the roles of taxation and law, they are walking paths he helped to open. What is striking, however, is that Adam Smith never advocated a society in which the state disappears. He recognized the need for laws, for education, for shared responsibility, elements that prevent markets from becoming arenas reserved only for the strong. Thus, the world built on his observations is not merely a world of transactions. It is a world constantly struggling to maintain a balance between efficiency and humanity. His presence, also lies in how we understand price and value. In modern life, prices function as a common language, enabling people to decide without grasping the entire system. Yet that very convenience creates a temptation to equate price with value, money with dignity. Adam Smith warned, in his own way, that labor could be narrowed, and people worn down when everything is measured too coldly. Today's world carries both sides of this legacy, the convenience of a shared language and the danger of allowing that language to become the only measure. If there is one reason Adam Smith's legacy is both powerful and fragile, it is its susceptibility to misunderstanding. When his observations are reduced to slogans, society can use them as excuses to legitimize indifference. But when we read him as a thinker who began with morality, we see that he never separated markets from people. He asked not only how societies generate wealth, but also whether those societies remain livable for the poor, the elderly, and the weary. That question makes a world built on observations not a purely bright picture, but a responsible one, where prosperity must be accompanied by protection. In modern life, we also see clearly something Adam Smith glimpsed in embryonic form. The more exchange and specialization increase, the more society depends on people whose names we do not know. This creates a strange feeling. We live among crowds and yet can feel lonely. We are served by entire systems and yet can feel invisible. For this reason, what Adam Smith wrote about recognition and dignity is not outdated. It reads like a reminder that markets can connect goods, but they do not automatically connect hearts. If society wishes to endure, it must build other bridges: education, morality, and shared responsibility. The world built on Adam Smith's observations, therefore, is not only a world of nations growing richer, it is a world of people learning to live within vast networks, where opportunity and risk travel together. It is a world in which making a living becomes central to life. So central that we sometimes forget to ask, what do we make a living for, and what remains when work ends? And it is precisely when that question begins to resonate that Adam Smith's legacy enters another zone. The zone of misunderstanding, of quotations severed from context, of the image of the father of capitalism simplified to the point of distortion. The world has used his name as a symbol for many things he never endorsed. And to truly understand him, one must look directly at how he has been misunderstood, reduced, and turned into a convenient label. From here, the next door opens naturally. How could a humanistic, cautious thought, rooted in sympathy and morality, be transformed into a slogan for greed? Why is a thinker who wrote about dignity so often remembered by a single phrase? When the light of a legacy passes through generations, it can be broken into fragments. And those fragments sometimes obscure the original flame. There are ideas that become easier to misunderstand the more famous they grow. Like a piece of music stripped of its harmony until only a few memorable notes remain. Adam Smith met precisely that fate. Posterity preserved one shining phrase, the invisible hand, and built an entire simplified image around it. A scholar who championed self-interest, a man who laid the foundations for a cold and ruthless capitalism. Yet if we read him as a human being, if we listen to him from where he truly began, ethics, sympathy, dignity, we see that what was lost in this simplification was not merely a few chapters of a book. What was lost was the humanistic spirit that nourished his entire body of thought. The first misunderstanding often arises from the habit of quotation. A sentence taken out of context can become a misleading signpost. When Adam Smith wrote that order could emerge from countless individual decisions, He was describing a social phenomenon, not granting it absolute moral authority. In his thinking, the market was not the supreme judge of right and wrong. It was merely a mechanism of allocation, functioning under specific conditions. Trust still exists. Minimal laws are upheld. Competition is not distorted by privilege, and human beings still feel shame in the face of injustice. When those conditions disappear, the mechanism does not magically become gentle. It can turn into a cold current, sweeping away the weakest. The second misunderstanding comes from assigning Adam Smith a role he never claimed for himself, the father of capitalism in the sense of glorifying greed. He did not write to celebrate cruelty. He wrote to understand how society functions, always conscious of human limits within that system. He warned that overly narrow work could constrict the mind. He cared about the poor, the elderly, and the weary. He emphasized education and shared responsibility as supports that markets require. None of this belongs to a doctrine of pure leave it alone, as it is often portrayed. It belongs to a cautious vision. Markets can generate wealth, but society must protect people from the darker consequences that markets do not recognize on their own. The third simplification, and the most common, is turning Adam Smith into a symbol of pure self-interest. Yet in his thought, self-interest always exists under the gaze of others. Human beings do not merely want more, they want respect. They do not only fear deprivation, they also fear contempt. And it is precisely that fear, that desire for recognition, which helps prevent society from sliding entirely into chaos. Adam Smith did not describe people as calculating machines of interest. He described them as complex beings, both selfish and sympathetic, both strategic and conscientious. Remove that complexity, and Adam Smith disappears. What remains is only a convenient shadow for debate. Why has this misunderstanding proven so enduring? Perhaps because it serves the needs of many eras. Some require a symbol for justification. That is the law of the market. That is nature. That is what Adam Smith said. Others need a symbol to condemn. All injustice begins here. Both approaches are easier than reading him as a nuanced, contradictory human being. Both save effort. One label suffices. Complexity need not be faced. Yet the strange thing is that despite being misunderstood, Adam Smith's thought still lives. It lives not because it is perfect, but because it touches a very real structure of society. Human beings depend on one another through labor and exchange. It lives in how nations design policy, how businesses organize work, and how people believe their skills can be transformed into a place within shared life. It also lives in the cracks, when labor becomes meaningless, when markets grow indifferent, when the elderly and the poor are left behind. For even those cracks illuminate the question Adam Smith never abandoned. A society may grow wealthier, but does it still preserve its humanity? At a deeper level, still living also means still capable of being reread fairly. When we strip Adam Smith of slogans, we encounter a mind that began with sympathy. We see a thinker who understood that dignity cannot be priced like a commodity. We see an observer who valued society's capacity for self-adjustment, yet never ceased to remind us that self-adjustment does not replace responsibility. Seen this way, his thought is no longer a story of the 18th century alone. It becomes a mirror for the modern age. Each time society invokes the market to abandon people, we are witnessing a distorted version of what he once described. For this reason, to say misunderstood, simplified, yet still alive, is not merely a comment on reputation. It is a reminder of the necessity of rereading. Rereading to see that Adam Smith did not hand us a moral formula, but a way of observing. Look at people before systems. Look at dignity before output. Look at those left behind before celebrating the winners. Preserving that way of seeing is why his thought endures. It does not merely explain how societies become wealthy. It forces us to ask whether those societies remain worth living in. And when the layers of misunderstanding are peeled away, what remains is often not a new slogan, but a deeply human feeling, a sense of relief. Relief that Adam Smith was not a champion of cruelty. Relief that from the very beginning he sought to protect something simple. When work and money become central, humanity must not disappear. From here, the path naturally leads toward the conclusion, not as a door being shut, but like lowering a lantern onto the surface of water and letting it drift slowly through the night. Having passed through misunderstandings, reductions, and labels, what remains to be said can be whispered more gently. Work may be important, but it is not the final measure of human worth. When work ends through age, exhaustion, or misfortune, dignity must still have a place. And a mature society is one that grants people the right to rest, without treating them as though they have lost their value. When a long day comes to a close, the first thing we do is not to review every action we took, what was right or wrong. We simply want to breathe more slowly, to set down what we have been carrying all day, responsibilities, worries, and sometimes even the feeling that we must always be useful in order to deserve existence. And perhaps it is precisely in that quiet moment that the greatest question of a human life returns. If work ends, what remains? Here, Adam Smith appears not as a statue of capitalism, but as a man who foresaw the fragility of human dignity when society increasingly binds human worth to productivity. He observed labor, exchange, and division of work, the mechanisms that generate prosperity. He also saw their reverse side. Work that becomes too narrow can narrow the mind. Markets can grow cold without ethics, and the vulnerable are easily pushed to the margins when their ability to participate in networks of exchange declines. Thus, as we arrive at this ending, the most important message is no longer, how can society grow richer, but rather, how can society grow richer without making human beings smaller? The perspective about Adam Smith worth preserving, to me, lies in an apparent paradox. He helped the world understand the mechanisms that create wealth, yet he never treated wealth as the ultimate end. If one were to capture him in an image, he would resemble someone standing at the edge of a crowded marketplace, not rushing to buy or sell, but quietly observing and remembering who is exchanging with whom, who relies on whom, who is being overlooked. From that observation, he left modern economics a guiding principle. To understand prosperity, look to labor and exchange. To preserve prosperity over time, look to ethics, education, and dignity. That legacy, despite being misunderstood many times, has contributed enormously to human prosperity. It helped nations understand that wealth does not arise merely from hoarded gold and silver, but from society's capacity to coordinate. The division of labor, specialization, the expansion of exchange, the creation of productivity and abundance. And that abundance, in modern history, has indirectly sustained millions of ordinary lives, workers with more stable employment, farmers with broader markets, laborers with opportunities to shift occupations rather than remain bound to the fate of their birthplace. Many people today can learn a skill, enter a vast network, and live by their own abilities, something that, at a deep level, bears the imprint of the foundations Adam Smith laid through his observations. Yet his legacy does not reside only in upward lines of growth. It also lies in a quiet reminder that markets do not generate compassion on their own. If society pursues efficiency while forgetting people, it creates spiritual fractures. The elderly become invisible, the poor are treated as system errors, and the exhausted are dismissed as those who fell behind. Adam Smith never wished for such a world. He began with sympathy. He believed that people need recognition, not only because they produce output, but because they are human. From that belief, he placed education and shared responsibility as protective layers to prevent systems of livelihood from sliding into cruelty. Therefore, when work ends, humanity should not, is not merely a graceful closing line. It is an ethical standard applied to the entire story. It reminds us that there are phases of life when work inevitably slows: old age, illness, exhaustion, upheaval. No one moves through an entire life in a state of usefulness, as defined by the market. If society celebrates only those who can still run fast, it plants fear in everyone's heart, the fear of being abandoned when strength fades. A mature economy is one that knows how to create prosperity, but also knows how to create places of rest, where people are still respected when they are no longer as productive as before. This is where Adam Smith becomes unexpectedly close to us. He does not ask us to become saints. He asks only that we not forget something fundamental. Society is a network of mutual dependence. The strong today were once weak in the past, and will be weak again at some point in the future. If we want a world in which workers can stand upright, farmers can make a living, and the vulnerable are not turned into burdens, then we must preserve the ethical core that Adam Smith always carried with him, even when he spoke of markets. And perhaps that is his most enduring legacy. He gave us a way of seeing that is both realistic and humane. He did not deny the power of self-interest in motivating labor and exchange, but he did not allow that interest to become an excuse for turning away from one another. He gave contemporary economics an axis of balance between efficiency and dignity, between markets and ethics, between growth and recognition. With that axis, we can move beyond the simplistic argument of whether markets are good or bad, and toward the more important question: how can markets serve human beings rather than consume them? Tonight, as the story draws to a close, what matters most may not be whether you remember exactly which page Adam Smith wrote on or which year he lived in. What matters is a lighter feeling you can carry with you. Your value does not reside entirely in productivity. Work may be part of life, but it is not the whole of a human being. And if society is truly mature, it will know how to say to those who are tired, "You still belong here, even when you can no longer run." That is how I wish to keep Adam Smith in memory, not as the emblem of a system, but as someone who saw that prosperity could be created through cooperation, and who also saw that such prosperity is only worthwhile when it does not cause human beings to lose their humanity. When work ends, humanity must not end with it. And that quiet yet enduring reminder continues to illuminate how we think about economics, about justice, and about a society kind enough to allow people to rest.